If you lined up every man who has ever lived, going all the way back to the earliest humans wandering out of Africa, and asked a simple question, how many women did the average guy actually sleep with, marry, or father children with? The answer would break most people's brains. Because the honest answer isn't one. It isn't a few. For huge stretches of human history, for the majority of men who ever drew breath, the real answer is closer to zero. Let that sit for a second. Zero. Meanwhile, a tiny sliver of men were out here fathering hundreds of kids, building family trees so wide they'd need their own zip code. So, which is it? Was ancient man a monogamous family guy or a walking harem operation? The truth is messier, weirder, and honestly a lot more brutal than either version, and by the end of this, you're going to understand why your own DNA is basically a court document proving it. Let's start with the piece of evidence that blew this whole topic wide open, because it didn't come from some dusty scroll or cave painting. It came from a lab. Back in 2015, a team of geneticists published a study looking at genetic diversity on the Y chromosome, the chromosome passed exclusively from father to son, compared to diversity on other parts of the genome that come from both parents. What they found was strange. Around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, Y chromosome diversity around the world took a nosedive. Not a little dip, a collapse. It's estimated that during this period, for roughly every 17 women who successfully reproduced, only one man did, 17 to 1. Now, before you picture cavemen literally running around with 17 wives each, that's not quite what this means, and this is where almost every video on this topic gets it wrong. This bottleneck doesn't necessarily mean 17 women were physically sharing one husband in a hut somewhere. It means that across generations, the reproductive success of men became insanely lopsided. A small number of male lineages were producing sons who survived, thrived, and had their own sons, while the vast majority of male lineages simply died out. No sons, no grandsons. Game over for that line, forever. Women, on the other hand, were reproducing at much more even rates across the population. Almost every woman who survived to adulthood had a decent shot at having children who also survived. Men, wildly unequal odds. Some fathered dynasties. Most fathered nothing that made it to today. So why did this happen right around that time frame? This is the fun part because the timing lines up almost perfectly with something enormous happening in human history. The shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. Before farming, most human groups were small, mobile, and relatively flat in terms of hierarchy. You couldn't hoard grain if grain didn't exist yet as a stored commodity. You couldn't build a private army if there was no surplus to pay soldiers with. Anthropological studies of modern-day hunter-gatherer societies, which aren't a perfect time machine back to the Paleolithic, but they're the closest living comparison we've got, tend to show relatively low levels of polygyny. Most men had one partner, sometimes two, rarely more, because resources were shared, and stockpiling a dozen wives wasn't really an option when everyone had to keep moving to find the next meal. Then agriculture happened, and everything changed. Suddenly you could grow food, store it, and, critically, control who got access to it. Land became ownable, wealth became stackable, and once wealth becomes stackable, power becomes stackable too. A handful of men figured out how to accumulate enormous amounts of both. And once you have enormous wealth and power in a species like ours, you know exactly what happens next. Reproductive access gets hoarded right along with the grain. This is where the harem enters the story. And I don't mean that in some vague, romanticized, sultan lounging on cushions way. I mean actual, documented, mind-bending numbers. Take Moulay Ismail, the ruler of Morocco in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Historical records, and yes, some of these numbers are debated by historians because record-keeping back then wasn't exactly rigorous. Credit him with somewhere around 888 children. Not wives. Children. He kept a harem reportedly numbering in the hundreds and dedicated an almost industrial level of effort toward producing offspring. Whether the number is slightly inflated by court scribes trying to flatter him or not, the scale is still staggering, and it perfectly illustrates the pattern. One man absorbing the reproductive output of an entire small city's worth of women, while somewhere else, hundreds of regular guys were living their entire lives without a wife at all. And Moulay Ismail isn't even the most extreme case. Genetic research published in the early 2000s traced a Y chromosome signature found in roughly 8% of men across a huge swath of Asia. That's about 16 million living men today, back to a single common ancestor living around 800 years ago. The leading theory, based on the geography and timing, points to Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. Genghis Khan's conquests weren't just about territory. Historical accounts describe the systematic practice of the victors taking wives and concubines from conquered populations. And his sons and grandsons continued the tradition of massive harems as they expanded the Mongol Empire across Asia. 16 million descendants, from one genetic line. That's not an exaggeration for a YouTube thumbnail. That's a real peer-reviewed finding. When people talk about alpha male nonsense online, they have absolutely no idea that the actual historical record of hyper-successful reproduction looks like continent-spanning military conquest and the literal redistribution of an empire's female population. Not a guy at the gym doing curls in the mirror. But let's zoom out from the Genghis Khans and Moulay Ismails of history, because they're the extreme outliers, the top 0.001%. What was happening to everyone else? Ancient civilizations were built around steep social pyramids, and access to women tracked almost perfectly with where you sat on that pyramid. In ancient Mesopotamia, kings and high priests maintained multiple wives and concubines as a normal part of elite life. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs are well documented as having had numerous wives. Rameses II is credited with over 100 children from a harem of wives and concubines that historians estimate numbered somewhere in the dozens. In imperial China, emperors maintained enormous harem systems, with some dynasties formalizing thousands of women living within palace walls specifically to serve the reproductive and social needs of the emperor and his court. The Ottoman sultans had their harems. Various African kingdoms had systems of royal wives numbering in the hundreds. This wasn't some rare cultural quirk, it was one of the most common features of stratified ancient societies across basically every continent. Meanwhile, down at the bottom of these same pyramids, you had an enormous population of men who were essentially locked out of the reproductive market entirely. Farmers, laborers, soldiers, slaves, the guys doing the actual back-breaking work that made the empire function, who in return got, often, nothing. No wife, no children, no lineage. Just labor, and then death, and then their name disappears from history because there was no descendant left to remember it. This is the part that most content on this topic completely skips over, because it's not as fun to talk about as harems and conquerors. But it's honestly the more important half of the story. For every Genghis Khan siphoning off dozens of women, there were potentially hundreds of men who got absolutely nothing. And here's the thing that should genuinely unsettle you. Those men didn't just quietly accept it. Historians and anthropologists studying resource and mate competition have long pointed out that societies with a large surplus of reproductively unsuccessful young men tend to be more violent, more prone to warfare, and more prone to risky, aggressive behavior in general. This isn't some fringe theory. It's been studied in the context of everything from ancient tribal warfare to more recent conflicts in regions with skewed sex ratios. When a chunk of the male population has no path to a family, no stake in the existing social order, and nothing much left to lose, war and violence start looking like the only viable path to changing your circumstances. Conquest wasn't just about land and gold. For a lot of foot soldiers, war was quite literally the only mechanism by which they might improve their reproductive prospects. Through plunder, through captured women, through elevated status if they survived and came home a hero instead of just another farmer. So, in a strange way, the reproductive bottleneck and the near-constant state of ancient warfare aren't two separate stories. They're the same story, told from two different angles. Now let's rewind even further, before agriculture, before empires, before harems, back to the hunter-gatherer bands that made up the vast majority of human existence. Homo sapiens has been around for roughly 300,000 years. Agriculture has only been around for about 12,000 of those years. That means for over 95% of our species' history, we were living in small, mobile, foraging groups. And the mating patterns in that world looked completely different from the empire and harem model. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. In small bands of maybe 25 to 50 people, there simply weren't the resources or the social structures to support one man hoarding a dozen wives while everyone else got nothing. Anthropologists studying modern-day hunter-gatherer groups, the Hadza in Tanzania, the Juhuanzi in southern Africa, among others, generally find patterns of mostly monogamous or mildly polygynous relationships, with high rates of separation and remarriage over a lifetime. So instead of one man having 5 wives simultaneously, you'd more often see serial pairing, a man and a woman together for some years, splitting up, forming new pairs over the course of a lifetime. Multiple partners over time, sure, but rarely multiple partners at once. And rarely with the insane skew you'd see in agricultural, hierarchical societies. There's actually a clever piece of biological evidence that backs this up, and it doesn't require a single historical record. It's baked directly into our bodies. It's called sexual dimorphism, which is basically the size difference between males and females of a species, and it turns out to be a surprisingly reliable predictor of mating systems across the animal kingdom. Take gorillas. Male gorillas are dramatically larger than females, sometimes twice the body mass. Gorillas live in a classic harem structure. One dominant male, multiple females, and the size difference exists because males are in near constant physical competition with other males for the chance to control that harem. Bigger, stronger males win, so evolution keeps cranking up the size gap. Now take gibbons, which are monogamous. Male and female gibbons are nearly identical in size because there's no harem to fight over. Competition between males for multiple partners is minimal, so there's no evolutionary pressure pushing males to get bigger and scarier than females. Humans sit in an interesting middle ground. Men are, on average, somewhat larger and stronger than women, maybe 15 to 20% heavier on average, but nowhere near the gorilla-level extreme. What does that tell us? It tells us that throughout our evolutionary history, human mating patterns were probably mildly polygynous on average. More competition among men for mates than a strictly monogamous species would show, but nowhere near the winner-take-all harem structure of a gorilla troop. Our bodies are basically carrying around a physical record of millions of years of some competition, not total domination. So if you zoom all the way out, here's the actual shape of the story. For the vast majority of human history, the hunter-gatherer chunk, mating patterns were relatively balanced, tilted slightly toward polygyny, but nothing close to extreme. Then agriculture shows up roughly 12,000 years ago, wealth and hierarchy get invented, and suddenly you get this insane spike where a tiny elite starts hoarding reproductive access on an industrial scale, leaving enormous numbers of regular men with nothing. That's your 17-to-1 bottleneck. That's your Genghis Khans and Moulay Ismails. And that's also your surplus of desperate, angry, unattached young men fueling constant warfare, which, brutal as it sounds, was in its own twisted way a reproductive strategy of last resort. Then something else happened, and this part doesn't get nearly enough attention. Monogamy started making a comeback, and it wasn't because ancient societies suddenly discovered romantic love or decided polygyny was morally wrong. It happened for cold, practical, almost mathematical reasons. Researchers studying the shift toward socially imposed monogamy, meaning cultures that started enforcing one-wife rules through law, religion, or custom, even for wealthy and powerful men, have proposed that this shift was, in large part, a solution to exactly the violence problem we just talked about. A society where a handful of elite men control most of the available wives is a society sitting on top of a mountain of unmarried, resentful young men. That's a recipe for instability. More crime, more uprisings, more war, harder to govern. Societies that switched to enforced monogamy, one wife per man, regardless of wealth, tended to end up more stable. Fewer status-driven conflicts, lower crime rates. More men invested in the existing social system because they actually had a stake in it. A wife, a family, something to protect, and something to lose. Some researchers even argue that the switch to monogamy helped fuel long-term economic growth, because instead of rich men blowing all their wealth on maintaining giant harems, resources got redirected toward things like education, business investment, and raising fewer, more resourced children per household. So monogamy, in a lot of ways, wasn't a moral awakening. It was a social pressure valve, released because a civilization full of angry, unmarried men is a civilization that eventually burns itself down. All right, so let's actually try to land on an answer here because we've covered empires and gorillas and genetic bottlenecks, and I still haven't given you a number. If you're asking how many women did the average ancient man have across his lifetime, factoring in every single man who ever lived, elite and peasant, hunter-gatherer and farmer, the honest statistical answer is somewhere between 0 and 1. Not because ancient life was some cute monogamous fairy tale, but because the distribution was so wildly skewed toward a small number of extremely successful men that it drags the average down for everyone else. Remember, when one man is fathering hundreds of children and hundreds of other men are fathering none, the math evens out to something that looks deceptively modest on paper, even though the lived reality for any individual man could range from harem-owning emperor to died alone, no children, forgotten by history. If you're asking a slightly different question, what did a typical marriage look like for an average non-elite man in most ancient farming societies? The answer looks a lot more like what we'd recognize today. One wife, sometimes a second if he had enough wealth and status, occasionally none if he was poor, low status, or unlucky. Multiple wives were absolutely a real and common practice among elites across nearly every ancient civilization you can name, but for the guy tilling the field or herding the goats, one partner, if he was lucky enough to have any at all, was the far more typical experience. And if you go back before agriculture, into that 95% of human history spent as small foraging bands, the picture shifts again toward mild polygyny with a lot of serial pairing. Relationships forming and dissolving and reforming across a person's lifetime, rather than one man simultaneously juggling a dozen partners. 3 very different eras. 3 very different answers. All technically true depending on which slice of ancient man you're asking about. Here's what I think is genuinely the wildest part of this entire topic, though. It's not the harem numbers, and it's not even the 16 million descendants of one guy on horseback. It's what this bottleneck actually did to the human gene pool, permanently, forever. Every single person alive today is, statistically, far more likely to be descended from one of those reproductively hyper-successful ancient men than from one of the far more numerous men who left no descendants at all. That means a huge chunk of the traits, tendencies, and yes, probably even some behavioral patterns that got you here reading this script right now, trace back not to some average ancient guy peacefully farming his plot of land with his one wife, but to the small, ruthless, often violent minority of men who managed to claw their way to the top of an insanely competitive and unequal reproductive hierarchy. The peaceful, cooperative, resource-sharing hunter-gatherer instincts are in there too, layered underneath, from that far longer 95% of our history. But so is the other stuff. The drive to compete, to accumulate, to dominate when the opportunity presents itself. Because that's exactly the trait set that got disproportionately passed down during those bottleneck centuries. You are, in a very literal genetic sense, walking around with the DNA of history's winners, and winning in the ancient reproductive game very often meant conquest, hierarchy, and brutal inequality rather than some peaceful nuclear family ideal. So the next time someone tells you humans are naturally monogamous or naturally polygamous, like it's some simple settled fact, you can tell them the actual answer is both, neither, and it depended entirely on when you were born, what your society looked like, and, brutally, whether you were born into wealth and power or into the enormous, mostly forgotten mass of men who worked the land, fought the wars, and, for the vast majority of them, never had the chance to pass anything down at all. And honestly, that might be the most important takeaway buried in all of this. We tend to imagine history as this steady progression of normal family units stretching back into the mists of time. A man, a woman, a few kids, a hut, some livestock. And for plenty of people, sure, that was reality. But underneath that comfortable picture is a much stranger, much more unequal system, where reproductive success was concentrated in the hands of the few, where entire male lineages vanished without a trace, and where the shift to something resembling the modern nuclear family only really solidified because societies figured out it was the more stable, more sustainable option. Not because it was always the natural order of things. The 17-to-1 bottleneck isn't a fringe factoid. It's a snapshot of an entire era of human history where power, wealth, and reproduction were locked together in an almost feudal system, playing out across nearly every major civilization on the planet independently, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica to Imperial China. And its fingerprints are still sitting quietly in your own genome, whether you ever think about it or not. So, 0 to 1 wife on average if you're counting every man who ever lived. Potentially dozens or hundreds if you happened to be born an emperor, a khan, or a sultan. And absolutely nothing at all if you were one of the countless men whose entire existence left no trace beyond the labor of their hands and the anonymity of an unmarked grave. That's the real answer, and it's a lot less romantic and a lot more strange than most people ever stop to consider.